About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like ridges in wheat. Ashes grow like wheat into the ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. I was more prepared. Ashes grow like wheat into the ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track and comes to rest, and gives it a ghastly creak and comes to rest. And immediately, ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up ash-gray men with leaden spades swarm up. Ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust that drift endlessly above it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot about them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river. When the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. I was curious to see her. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her. But I did. Taking the train with Tom... Damn it. Taking the train up... Going up to New York, was Tom on the train? Taking the train with Tom to New York? I was with Tom on the train. Going to New York with Tom on the train. When we stopped by the ash heaps, he leapt to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good bit at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was, on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards or so, under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small square of yellow bricks on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car in sight was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. When he saw He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old boy," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Soon. I've got my man working on it now." "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't. And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all." "I didn't mean it like that," Wilson insisted quickly. It just meant that his voice trailed off. Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman blocked the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s, faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously as some women can. Her face, above a dark blue dress of spotted crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was a immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves in her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips and, without turning around, spoke to her husband in a low, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down." "Oh, right," said Wilson, and hurried off in the direction of the office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his hair and his dark suit, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." "All right. We'll meet you on the lower level by the newsstand." Or by the newsstand on the lower level. She nodded and moved away from Tom, just as George Wilson emerged from the office door with 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was near the 4th of July, and we watched a gray, scrawny Italian child setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad tracks. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson? He thinks she goes to visit her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." And so, Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I went together on the train to New York. Or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred at least that much, to the sensibility of those East Eggers who may have been on the train. She had changed her dress into a brown-figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her down from the train in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and the Broadway and a moving pictures magazine. At the station drugstore, she bought a small flask of perfume. She bought some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. In the solemn, echoing drive, she let four taxicabs drive away before selecting a new one, lavender in color with a gray interior. And in this, we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately, she turned from the window and tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said, earnestly. "They're a nice thing to have, a dog." Yuki. So we backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. Swung from his neck was a basket of very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. Swung from his neck cowered a basket of very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. What kind are they? Asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly. All kinds, lady. All kinds. What kind do you want, lady? I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I think I'd like to get one of those police dogs, she said earnestly. I don't suppose you got that kind. The man peered doubtfully into his basket, plunged in a hand, and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. That's no police dog, said Tom. No, said the man with disappointment in his voice. It's more of an Airedale. He ran a hand over the brown wash rag of the back. Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold. I think it's cute, said Miss Wilson enthusiastically. How much is it? That dog? That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale. Certainly there was some Airedale mixed up in it somewhere, though its paws were shockingly white. Changed hands and settled down into Miss Wilson's lap where she she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. That dog? That's a boy, said the man. It's a bitch, said Tom. Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it. We drove over to Fifth Avenue, warm and soft, almost pastoral on a soft summer day. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. I've got to leave you here, I said. Hold on, I said. I've got to leave you here. No, you don't, interposed Tom quickly. Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you don't at least come up to the apartment, won't you, Myrtle? Come on, said Mrs. Wilson. I'll telephone my sister, Catherine. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know. We continued on over the West Hundreds towards 158th Street, where we stopped at one slice in a long white cake of white apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson collected the dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. I'm going to have the McKees come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course I've got to telephone my sister Catherine. The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. And it was packed to the doors with tapestried furniture entirely too large for it. So that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. There was one picture on the wall which appeared to be a hen sitting on a rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself to be a bonnet and the rock to be the countenance of a stout old lady. There were some Broadway scandal sheets and a copy of Simon Called Peter. A reluctant elevator boy was dispatched for a box of straw and some milk, to which he added of his own volition a box of hard dog biscuits, one of which sat decomposing apathetically in a saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom produced a bottle of whiskey from behind a locked cabinet, from a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, even though the apartment was full of sunshine until 8 o'clock. First, there were no cigarettes, and so I went out to the corner store to get some. When I returned, Tom and Mrs. Wilson had disappeared, so I sat discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either the whiskey had distorted things or it was terrible stuff, because it made no sense to me. When Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, we called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced arriving at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment had given a blurred air to her face. As she moved, she jangled. There was an incessant clicking as she moved about because of innumerable pottery bracelets that jangled up and down her arms. She came in with such proprietary haste and looked at the furniture so possessively I wondered if she lived there. When I asked this, however, she repeated my question out loud, laughed immoderately, and said that she lived at an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a slender, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a spot of white lather on his cheeks, and he was most polite in his greetings to everyone in the room. Most polite in his greetings to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer, and it was he who had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother that hung on the wall like an ectoplasm. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told us with pride that that since they'd been married, her husband had photographed her 127 times. Mrs. Wilson had changed her dress, had changed her costume again, and had changed her dress again into a cream-colored chiffon, an afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which rustled continuously as she moved. With a change of costume had come a change of attitude. Gone was the impressive vitality from the garage, and it was replaced with mighty hauteur? Something hauteur. And as she grew bigger, the apartment grew smaller until she seemed to pivot in the center of the noisy, smoky room. These fellows will cheat you every time, she said. Most of them, all they look out for is money. I had this woman up here to look at my feet, and when she sent me the bill, you'd have thought she had my appendicitis out. What was her name? Asked Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Eckerbert. She looks at people's feet in their home. Feet in their homes. I love you in that dress, said Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. This thing, she said with disdain. This crazy old thing, it's just something I put on when I don't know what to wear, when I don't care what I look like. But it looks wonderful on you, insisted Mrs. McKee. If Chester could get you in that pose, I think he could really do something with it. We all looked at her in silence. Mrs. Wilson moved a hair from her face.